I've given this talk a bunch of times, or a derivative of this talk, but it's really different today because of something that happened to me about 6 months ago. I should tell you before I begin that I'm going to live a very long time. The doctors say so, but I wasn't sure of that 6 months ago. You see, my beautiful wife, after losing a family member of her own, decided she wanted to get me checked out in case there was anything wrong. And so she took me to the hospital and checked into the hospital for a bunch of routine tests that guys in their 50s get. And they came back and said, your brain looks awesome. There's nothing wrong with your brain. And I was like, great. And they came back and said, your lungs look amazing. There's nothing wrong with your lungs. I said, it's great. They said, Don, your arteries, you have the arteries of a 12-year-old. And I thought, that's statistically impossible considering how many Oreos I have eaten. But I'll go with that. And then on day 3, the doctor came in. It was over a weekend, so they were sort of short-staffed. And the doctor didn't look very happy. And he put his hand on my knee and he said, I've got some news for you. It's your heart. It's stiff. It's not very flexible. And he gave it a name. I won't go into it. But he sort of put his hand on my knee. And of course, I'm in a little bit of denial because I feel amazing. I've never felt better. And he said, look, we're going to get you in to see a cardiologist. Unfortunately, it's about 8 days before we can get you in, as soon as we can get you in. But you just be careful, and we'll see you in a week. And they let me go. Unreasonable hospitality. So I get home, and my wife says, Don, you're fine. Yeah, everything's going to be great. I said, I don't know. The look in his eye was pretty dark. I'm not sure. And one night, I think it was the next night, I made the mistake of Googling this diagnosis. And I Googled the diagnosis, and then I Googled the words life expectancy, and it popped up immediately, 1 to 5 years. And then I did the deep dive. I just kept looking and looking and looking, and I couldn't find anything online that said I was here in 5 years. 80%, at least, people who had this diagnosis are gone, and within 5 years. And it terrified me. I took this news to my wife, and she said, well, Don, technically, this, and that, and just wait a week, and let's talk to somebody. Again, you feel great, and he said you have no symptoms, which is a great sign. And I said, I don't know. And to be honest with you, I got married at 42, late in life, late bloomer, became a dad at 49. And to me, the greatest, I had all sorts of success, but the connection was, rule number 1 was don't cry. The connection that I've gotten since I've become a father and a husband eclipses anything else. And so suddenly the stakes were really high, and they had never been high before. They were very, very high. We have a 3-year-old daughter. She is the light of my life. Her name is Emmeline, and I love the role of father. Emmeline and I, almost every day, we jump in the pool. She's learning to swim. She's 3, and she will swim out toward me. She always wants to go further and further, and she'll swim out toward me, and then I turn around, and she swims back. And occasionally, she tells me to go a little bit too far, and so instead of letting her swim all the way toward me, I will move toward her, and she gets very mad at me. She says, Dad, I can do it. And I say to Emmeline, I've said it, I think, every day for the past year, what is Daddy's job? And she says, Daddy's job is to protect me. And I said, and Daddy's going to do his job. I love that job. So I was terrified. Now again, I'm a bit delusional at this point. I've always been a pinprick of light at the end of the tunnel, and we're going to hit it. I have no doubt. This one was just the opposite. I mean, this thing was taking me down. Just the thought that this little girl would grow up without her dad. Whew, that was tough. I lost it. I've only ugly cried twice in my life. When my mother passed away, and about 6 months ago in my garage in a cold plunge. Now, Julio Gonzalez, where is he? He cold plunges. We bonded on that. We don't cold plunge together, but we cold in different places. By the way, how do you know if somebody cold plunges? Yeah, they'll tell you. Yeah, they'll tell you. You don't have to guess. And I'm in this cold plunge, and I'm bawling, and I'm crying out to God. I'm like, you can't take me. right? Just give me 20 years, give me 25 years. I'm doing the math on when a little girl can lose her dad and it's not just too traumatic. And that's the number, right? We got to get there. And everything suddenly changed for me during this 8 days. Now, 8 days later, we go in to see the cardiologist. My wife is sitting there. She's very optimistic, very hopeful. The nurse comes in. The first question is, do you have your will and your estate in order? It's her first question. Again, unreasonable hospitality. She finishes, and the doctor comes in, and he starts with the same sort of thing. He's talking about this, and here's how it works, and this and this and that. And I just interrupted him. I said, Doc, am I here in 20 years? And he said, of course, yes. Yeah, we're going to do this and do this, and you're here. And I looked at my wife and said, honey, I'm here in 20 years. I said, any chance I'm here in 30 years? Am I going to make 80? And he said, yeah, if you eat well and take care of yourself, you can make 80. Looked at my wife and said, Don, I told you, that's great. I said, 90? He said, there's a chance you can make 90. I said, honey, I can make 90. She goes, eh. And everything right now is fantastic. The modern medicine is incredible, and I'm going to be great, and I feel great, so please don't feel sorry for me. That's not the point of this talk. The point of this talk is what happened in the 8 days when I could feel the credits rolling. This thing is over before you want it to be over. First of all, everything that mattered to me in life stopped mattering. Everything that drove me, I could care less about. Knee-deep into a book that I think would have been a legacy book that would live way past me. Zero chance of me finishing that book. I don't care if you give me 5 years, I ain't writing that book. Because that book would cost me time with the people I love. And there are 3 levels of that. My family was first, and I didn't want to go because I love them so much. And there was so much meaning in that role that I get to play. Second was my buddies. We go fishing every year. Some of them are in this room. We call ourselves the Lions. We are ridiculous man-children. And I realized how much these men meant to me. And I was able to text them in some of my darkest moments and say, hey, I'm scared. And will you pray for me? And will you think of me? And times when I really didn't want to go to my wife because I didn't want her to see me being a wimp, I could go to these guys and let them see me being a wimp. And they were amazing. And third was my team. I run a company. We're a small company. We have about 30 employees. And I love them. I care for them. We work so much. We work so well together. I actually wrote out a plan, if I pass, how the team can take over ownership of the company, and sat down with Tyler, who's here tonight or today, and he runs the company, and said, here's how I think we can transition this because I want this to live on. What mattered to me more than anything was not accomplishment, it was connection. When everything is being taken away, what matters is connection. I know I've been there. I know I was only pretend there. And by the way, if you can get a doctor to lie to you and say you're dying and a week later say he's kidding, do it. I may start that business. It's a fantastic experience because everything becomes really, really clear. What matters is connection. And then what occurred to me as all of this was happening was that this actual new understanding, maybe, I don't know what it is, of the meaning of life, had been under my nose for decades, and I just could have never saw it. For a living, I study story and story structure, and then I go into businesses and help them clarify their message using these kind of ancient narrative structures. It's total nerdville, but I just love doing it. And I'd been studying this stuff for so long, and I realized there's a character inside of these story structures that I've always admired, but sort of never fully understood. In stories, there are 4 main characters: the victim, the villain, the hero, and the guide. And this guide character became very interesting to me. Let me explain to you what I'm talking about. Now, I want to introduce you to a story structure. Let me just let you know that I'm going to ruin stories for you forever. They are very, very formulaic, and if you know them, you can pretty much predict what's going to happen in a story. My wife hates going to movies with me because she knows at some point I'm going to elbow her and say, that guy dies in 31 minutes, and he does. He always does. But let me just introduce you to how a story works, because I want to explore this role of guide. And first I'm going to do it in the context of narrative so that you understand. And then I want to talk about the role of guide in the role that you play in life. A story works this way. You have a character, and the character wants something. It has to be really crystal clear defined. The character wants to disarm the bomb or marry his high school sweetheart or win the race. It's incredibly defined what the character wants. But we can't let the character get what they want. There has to be something in between the character and them getting what they want, and that's the problem. The problem is really the hook of the story, and all the way through the 90 minutes of the movie, this character is going to have problem after problem after problem after problem, because if they don't, you will stop paying attention. So there are all these challenges, but we know intuitively a character can't solve their problem on their own. They need help. And so thousands of years ago, a character was invented. Some scholars call them the wizard, some the mentor. I call them the guide. And the guide shows up to help the character win the day. The guide is many things, usually the strongest character in the story, the most capable, the most competent, has solved the hero's problem already in their own backstory. But the story is not about the guide, the story is about the hero. The guide usually delivers some sort of plan to the hero. This is the long Act 2 fading into Act 3, the challenges the hero has to overcome, the tests, the obstacles that the hero has to overcome. And then the hero finally, in the climactic or obligatory scene, is called to action to mano a mano face the villain. They duel it out, and if this thing ends well, the story ends with a happy ending, and if this thing ends poorly, of course, it's a tragedy. And that's every story you're gonna go see in a movie. It's every novel you're gonna read. It's this structure. And this structure exists in narrative because, for no other reason, it works. It gets your attention. And by the way, if you break these rules, you're walking out of the movie. I mean, anytime you walk out of a movie because you're bored, they broke one of these rules, guaranteed. This has been true since Plato wrote Poetics. It's been true for 2,500 years. It's not going to change. The question is why? Why does this narrative structure work so incredibly well to captivate a human brain? The human brain actually daydreams 80%, 30% of the time. The human brain daydreams 30% of the time. And that, by the way, is a survival mechanism. You will daydream when there is nothing being presented to you that helps you survive, except when you're watching a story, or when you're hearing a story, or when you're reading a story. The brain pays attention, and it locks in, and it will do this for hours. If you start The Bear, it'll do it the whole weekend. And you will consume enormous amounts of calories while this happens. I think this exists because it is an incredibly clarified version of life. The thing about stories is it's life explained extremely clearly. Life with all the dull stuff taken out. In other words, you are a single protagonist hero in a narrative. You are walking around and life is about you to some degree, and it is about you accomplishing something, some sort of mission. There are challenges that you are faced with, and you get help from people like Dr. Becky or many people who have been mentors of yours to help you understand those challenges and overcome them so that you can have some sort of obligatory or climactic scene and resolve those challenges. And this is repeated in plots and subplots throughout your entire life, and it will be until you die. And so when we watch a story, you just see it crystal clear, and you feel like, this is what life is about. I get it. And the brain loves and yearns for clarity. So something like $14 billion a year is spent at the box office. To buy what? Entertainment? Escape? No. Meaning. Clarity. Now, all of us start out as heroes in stories. When we are adolescents, we are trying to prove ourselves. I remember being young and wanting to be a writer and beginning to write and working on my craft and honing it and then finally getting a publishing deal and overcoming the fear of writing and the discipline it takes to sit down and wrestle with your mind. It was a heroic story. And then I had a book hit the New York Times. It stayed on the New York Times for a very long time. And something very interesting happened. It wasn't that satisfying. There was a diminishing return, in fact, on success. I remember hearing a similar story. I interviewed Pete Carroll. I'm a huge Seattle Seahawks fan, and I got the chance to sit down with Pete Carroll when he was coaching the Seahawks. And I asked him, what drives you? And what do you want in life? What do you want to accomplish? And Coach Carroll said, Don, I had the luxury of succeeding early. And I said, what do you mean you had the luxury of succeeding early? He said, well, when I was young, I won a bunch of athletic contests. And I realized that the more you win, the less it means. I said, why do you bring that up? He said, because that realization changed when I began coaching. When I began helping other people win, there was no diminishing return on meaning. That was fascinating to me. I think what Pete Carroll was describing was the role of guide. And I think it's the arc of a healthy human life to experience that transition, to move from hero to guide. So I want to explore a little bit of the characteristics of a guide. And I've never done this in front of an audience before, but I wanted to do it with this one because I think this room is full of guides. And maybe you don't know it. So what are some of the characteristics of the guide? Well, one thing is that the guide is actually the strongest character in the story. They are the hero. Let's think about it. They're ill-equipped, they're afraid, they're filled with self-doubt, they don't have what it takes, and they're in desperate need of help. The guide, on the other hand, is the strongest character in the story. In their backstory, they have conquered the hero's challenges, and they are in the story for one purpose, and that is to help the hero win the day. If we are to be guides, then, we have to be strong. We have to be capable. Another thing about the guide is the guide's story is all about the hero. It's a plot device, really, inside of narrative structure. The guide has to be about the hero winning the day, other-centered in that sense. The hero is everything. I think there's kind of 3 levels of self-esteem that I recognize in my own story. Maybe you could recognize them in yours. We grew up very poor. We stood in line for government cheese. We were certainly on the wrong side of the tracks in the small Texas town that I grew up in. Nobody in my family was ever expected to go to college. College was never spoken of in my home as any sort of ambition. My dad left when I was 2. I never met him until I was 35, and I had a book on the New York Times about him, and so I decided to go to his house and give him a copy. That's another lecture. But, it was an interesting journey, and I didn't have a lot of self-esteem, let's say. I hadn't ever accomplished much of anything. I think the first level of self-esteem is, I don't matter, and everybody else does. That's called low self-esteem. And then I noticed as I began to succeed in life, I moved to the second phase of low self-esteem, and that's this: I matter more than everybody else. This is kind of a healing phase that was very annoying to everybody, except for me. I got to tell you, I rather enjoyed it. But this is narcissism, right? The story is about me. And then there's this third level of self-esteem, and the third level of self-esteem is we matter a lot. Human beings matter a lot. It's not you are so much better than me or I am so much. We matter. And I think in service industries, and in every walk of life, these are the people who we love the most. The people who we meet them and they themselves have high self-esteem. They have accomplished something. They have believed in themselves, and they also believe that you belong. When my wife and I got married, we got married in New Orleans, where she is from, on a Sunday. On Monday night, the New Orleans Saints were playing the Seattle Seahawks on Monday Night Football, and I thought, we got to go there. Because depending on who wins that football game, this could set the tone for our marriage. So we flew to Seattle and went to the Monday Night Football game, and because I'd interviewed Pete Carroll, got to go on the field and look kind of cool in front of my wife, and it was really, really fun for us to do that. The Seahawks beat the New Orleans Saints. Didn't actually set the tone for my marriage. I was wrong about that. But I had been friends with the Canlish family for a long time, and I knew them, I loved them, they loved me. They'd invited me to the restaurant a few times, and I just thought, oh, gosh, I don't know, I don't really fit, right? This is not, if you don't know how I grew up, I'm gonna make a fool of myself, I'm gonna mispronounce things, I'm gonna mispronounce a bottle of wine, have to mortgage my house in order to pay for it. A little bit nervous, and so I'd never gone, but I thought, you know what, I'm gonna take Betsy, and I even bought a suit, not just for my wedding, but for this trip to this fine dining restaurant. And I was actually nervous. And we walk into the restaurant, and their attitude wasn't like, welcome, we're great to see you. Their attitude was literally like, it's about time, right? We have so been looking forward to you being here. And we had the night of our lives on our honeymoon before we flew out to Hawaii the next day. And because we were treated like equals to an institution that was great. And I want to point out this dynamic really clearly here, because part of the characteristic of a guide is they actually do pursue excellence. Not so that they can be better than you, but so that their words of encouragement and affirmation can actually mean more. I know this sounds sort of judgmental. I don't mean it that way. Ladies, if you were in a bar and George Clooney came up and said, look, I'm on my way out, I just had to point out, you are very radiant tonight. Happily married, you are beautiful and just an honor to be in the bar with you, and I'm gonna get it. That would mean a lot. Let's say it was just some dude who lived in his mother's basement, played video games, and not very well. It doesn't mean as much, right? And so what you're going to see is a very important narrative principle here. When screenwriters write screenplays, they actually establish how accomplished the guide actually is. There's a reason to pursue excellence, because the guide actually has to be the authority in the story. Their words have to mean something, and their words have to matter. That experience at Canlis was so wonderful that years later, about 5 years later, my mom called. And my mom said, Don, I've got hard news. I said, what is it, Mom? She said, well, I've got lung cancer. She never smoked a cigarette in her life. She's got lung cancer. She says, they're giving me about a year. I said, Mom, what do you want to do? What can I do? What can I do for you? She said, I want to travel. She said, let me come up to Portland. I live in Portland at the time. I said, you know what? Let me call you back. Talk to Betsy. Put her on a first-class ticket to Seattle. She'd hardly flown an airplane at all, right? She got off the plane, she's like, they handed me hot towels. And you know where we went? Canlis. Why? I wanted my mom to go to a place with a reputation that's stellar, but I don't care about the reputation, and I don't care about the food. What I wanted her to realize was the truth that she belonged with the best. Because she was the best. I wanted her to be with a guide who saw her as the hero and made the story about her, even just for a night. My mother sacrificed everything for us. For decades and decades, she just gave up her life for her kids, and she deserved that. And that night, she was treated like a hero. And as I thought, what's the magic formula for these people in these institutions who have this incredible voice of affirmation and encouragement? What's the formula? And the formula is they pursue excellence and do great things, but never think of themselves as any better than you. In fact, they want to bring you into that fold and treat you like the hero in the story, and their story is really about helping you win. These, by the way, are the leaders that we choose. These are the brands that we love. Sometimes we help politicians. I've worked in the Obama White House. I've helped Republicans sometimes with their messaging. And I'll analyze these races. And, here's Hillary Clinton. She loses to Donald Trump. Her tagline is, "I'm with her. She's the hero." We don't choose heroes. Went down to meet with Jeb Bush's campaign. Jeb Bush's campaign mantra was, "Jeb can fix it." Lowercase j with an exclamation point. Jeb. Jeb can fix it. North Korea just launched a missile. Who do we send? Jeb. Yeah, the reason we don't select heroes as leaders is because we intuitively know they are ill-equipped, afraid, need help, and aren't strong enough yet for the story to be about somebody else. Hurting people think about themselves. Strong people think about others. And so it's important that we do the therapy we need to do. That we're honest about who we are. That we work on the content of our character. That we do amazing things and we make something of ourselves. This is very important because your voice will mean so much more if you do. The last thing my daughter needs is for me to have the attitude of, I'm just not a very good dad. I'm not a very good protector, terrible provider, you're stuck with me. Unhelpful. So we have to live into that. And that night, we took my mom to Kansas and had the night of our lives. And later we went up in a seaplane and were able to go out to that same cabin that Brian and I went to. I didn't throw my mother in the river. Although cold plunging has many benefits we won't go there. Another characteristic of the guide is that they're the ones who have authority. And they don't actually apologize for that authority. This is a very important principle inside of narrative structures in order for the plot to work and captivate an audience. There's a couple scenes I want to point out in two of my favorite movies. Again, I have a 3-year-old, so the one on the right is going to make sense in a second. But The King's Speech. Lionel is the guide, and King George is the hero. Lionel's job is to help King George actually speak without a stutter. This movie won Best Picture, won an Academy Award. There's a critical scene in the movie, though, where King George finds out that Lionel has allowed him to misunderstand his credentials. He thought he was a doctor, and in fact, he's not. And King George confronts Lionel, and he says, "You said that you were a doctor, and you are not. All of this work that we have done is meaningless. You are not who you say you are." Now, in this moment, if the screenwriters have Lionel say something like, "You're right, we can grow together, I have things that I need to work on too," this movie does not win an Academy Award. It's very important in this moment that the guides stand in their authority. And so Lionel actually says to the king, "Listen, I never told you that I had a PhD. You thought that, but I never told it to you. That's your mistake. You should have asked. However, I have worked with so many soldiers coming back from war, helping them with speech impediments caused by trauma. How dare you say that I don't have the authority to help you?" And the movie goes on and they win an Oscar. Mary Poppins is the guide, not the hero in the story. George Banks is the hero in the story. He experiences the transformation. Mary Poppins doesn't change at all. Now, Mary Poppins is guiding this family through a series of exercises, and they are beginning to transform until one day everything falls apart down at the bank, and George Banks rushes back into the house, corners Mary Poppins on the stairs, and says, "You have some explaining to do." And she looks at him and she says, "Mary Poppins doesn't explain herself to anybody." And she storms up the stairs. These are critical scenes. What this means is that if we want to play the guide, we need to become authorities in some way, right? And we need to stand in that authority, and it needs to become our identity. I have the ability to help you. I know what I'm doing. Imagine this interview that Will had with Dr. Becky if she would have come out and said, "Listen, I don't know anything about kids." We're off to a bad start. And I think this is a comfort level that is difficult for a lot of people. But it's where you need to go. Your insecurities aren't serving anybody. Another thing that the guide does, and it's really beautiful, is the guide will often affirm the hero's transformation, often at the end of the movie or at the end of the novel. The guide comes back into the story to affirm that the hero is different than they were at the beginning. A whole story is really about this ill-equipped, scared, unwilling hero going through a journey of challenge after challenge after challenge and pain after pain after pain that is transformative so that they can gain the strength they need at the end to defeat the villain. And the issue, though, is after they defeat the villain, it is nearly impossible for the hero to look themselves in the mirror and say, "I'm different. I'm different." You need another human being to say that to you. And you know it. Some of those meaningful moments in your life, or that letter, or that email, or that word. I remember a guy named Al Andrews who was a guide in my life. I wrote a book, and the book did well, but this was pre-Amazon ranking, so I didn't know the book had done well. And it was probably 100 pounds over what I am now, and this guy flew me to Nashville, and he said, I love this book. I want to do a book reading. Will you come and do a book reading? And I got there, and, book reading is a bookstore, and he paid me to come. And I get there, and he said, we actually rented a theater. And I said, "Oh, no." I said, "You don't understand how book readings work. You get like 4 people. 2 of them think you're somebody else. And we're going to this book reading, and he literally pulls the truck over. He says, "You listen to me. You are going to change lives." He was almost mean about it. I thought he was going to kill me. And we pull up to the theater, and there's a line all the way around the block. And we did the reading that night, and after that reading, there was a line all the way around the block with people thinking maybe he'll do another one. And we did another one. I'll never forget that, mainly because there's never been a line around the block since. But the hero steps in and says the words that need to be said to affirm you are different and you have changed. There are people in this audience who are still waiting for those words from mom and dad, and you feel the pain of it today because you can't look at yourself in the mirror and say, "I'm different, I've changed." You need somebody else to do that. And I pray that for you because it's healing. This is a Peter Brand and Billy Bean, played by Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill. There's a great story, the great part of this movie, Moneyball, at the very, very end of the story. Peter Brand, Jonah Hill's character, is the guide in the story. Billy Bean is the hero of the story. And at the very end of the movie, Peter is sitting watching film of a AAA baseball game. Billy Bean has been offered a job with the Boston Red Sox, and he turned it down because he thinks this is a fluke, and he doesn't want to get himself into a situation where he's over his head. And Peter Brand is saying, no, you have something here. He says, I want to show you something. Brad Pitt comes over to the television screen. He says, watch, I want you to watch. This 280-pound AAA baseball player ends up hitting the ball, runs to first base to try to get a single, trips over first base, kind of rolls into the infield, and Peter pauses the video. And Billy Beane says, poor guy, fell down. And kind of lets it play a little bit, and you see this guy kind of dust himself off and go back to first. And he goes, no, you don't understand, Billy. Billy says, what? He goes, he doesn't realize yet that he's hit a home run. And then you see the 280-pound, this is my dream, by the way, 280-pound baseball player round the base. There's usually a scene, and this is important for us as guys, with our kids, with our teammates, to affirm, here's who you are now. You came through that. You overcame that. There's a cost when people don't have guides in their lives. It's severe. Whenever you see refugees crossing a border, guaranteed there are people in leadership somewhere who believed that they mattered more than others, rather than we matter. The statistics are staggering. Loneliness and isolation are associated with increased risk of premature mortality, depression, and cognitive decline. All summed up with this idea that we don't matter. You know why I think that's so damaging? Because it's a lie. We do. All of us. Whenever you hear somebody say, oh, we're pregnant, everybody gets really excited. Why? Human being is going to be born. That's amazing. I remember when we brought Emmeline home, it was just I've never driven so carefully. We took her to Whole Foods maybe a couple weeks later, and I was, hey, watch that cart. Human being here. You don't need any bananas, right? This protection that we have over human life, that's you. And when we metabolize that and understand it through accomplishment, through not just narcissistic belief, but the belief, the fundamental belief that human beings matter a lot, that voice and that perspective gives us the ability to heal others. My mother, in her lifetime, probably was never treated as well as she was treated at Canlis. The way they kind of hide the plates and they put them all on the table the same. It's amazing. She was blown away. The cocktails. My mother was Baptist, and so to get her drunk was such a pleasure. All right, I want to close by telling you about a guide in my life. His name is David Gentiles. And David Gentiles was my youth pastor when I was a kid in Texas. Again, my dad was gone, didn't have a whole lot of people in my life. And this guy, David Gentiles, asked me to write a guest column in the church newsletter. I wrote that column, got some affirmation, and that was it. I was hooked and have been writing ever since. David was an interesting guy. He was extremely talented. He was a great musician. He was a great writer himself. And I moved up to Portland. He stayed in Texas. We would keep in touch. He watched my career. I wrote books. Those books took off. And I always thought, why am I the guy getting the attention when that guy is amazing? And so we talk on the phone. I said, David, you got to write a book. You have so much wisdom. He goes, yeah, I really want to. What would you write about this and that? I'd call him 6 months later. "Hey, how's that book going? There was a guy who kind of needed some help, and we moved him into the house. And he was always connecting with people, never had time to do anything that would help him become known. This was his whole life. Played the guide. One day I got a call, and David had passed away in an accident. Now, by this time, his career had taken him to a small church in Austin, Texas, that I had visited. There were about 75 people there. It was really like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting gone very bad. This is the pinnacle of his career. And I just remember thinking, it's a crime that nobody knows who he is. I dedicated my second book to David Gentiles. They called and said, Don, can you come down? We would actually love for you to deliver the eulogy. We think David would have loved that. I said, I'm on the next plane. Got on the airplane, flew to Austin, and they called me when I got there and said, hey, it's not going to be at the church. A lot of people have called, so we suspect there's more people coming. There's a slightly larger church across town. We're going to do it there. Here's the address. Fantastic. A couple hours later, I get another call. A lot of people are calling. There's another church, mega church, across town. David would have hated that. It's an evening service, and I'm getting ready to go, going over my notes, and I get a church, hey, we've moved it to the baseball stadium. There are thousands of people coming. I pull up, there are 3 news trucks from the 3 major news networks lined up, and thousands of people, and was able to deliver his eulogy standing at home plate with risers of thousands of people for a man who never put his name on a book and was a pastor at a church with 50 people. And I opened the eulogy by saying this: David Gentiles was the best friend you had. He may not have been your closest friend, but he was the best human being that you knew. And that's why you're here. He played the guide his entire life. I say this to you to encourage you. Don't be surprised if you spend your lifetime playing the guide and you end up everybody's hero. It's a beautiful, meaningful life to live. I'll leave with this. You cannot play the guide unless you believe that your life matters and that you exist to help others believe that their life matters too. Thank you so much.